March 24th, 1945, Ramitelli Air Base, Italy. The ink pooled at the edge of Captain Lee Archer's fountain pen, trembling against the thin paper like blood refusing to clot. Outside his tent, the Mediterranean wind carried the acrid smell of aviation fuel, mixed with olive groves, a scent that had become as familiar as his own sweat. He had just returned from his 169th combat mission. His hands wouldn't stop shaking. "Dear Mother," he wrote, each letter fighting against the tremor in his fingers. "Today we escorted the big friends to Berlin. All came home. All came home." 4 simple words that concealed a mathematical miracle no other fighter group in the entire European theatre could claim. Behind him, the distinctive hum of Merlin engines winding down filled the Adriatic twilight. 23P 51 Mustangs, their tails painted blood-red, taxied into reverent silence. 23 pilots climbed down from cockpits still warm from 30,000 feet above enemy territory. 23 black men who had just written another page in a book that America refused to read. Archer paused, his pen hovering over the paper. He wanted to tell her about the Messerschmitt jet fighter he'd nearly caught, about how Roscoe Brown had actually shot one down that very afternoon, making history that would be footnoted, marginalized, or erased entirely. He wanted to tell her about the B-17 crews who waved at them, grateful, alive because of the red tail's protection. He wanted to tell her that they had proven everything and changed nothing. But what none of them knew was that even as they accumulated the most extraordinary combat record in American aviation history, their story was already being buried beneath the weight of a nation unwilling to celebrate heroes who looked like them. To understand the magnitude of what the Tuskegee Airmen achieved in the skies over Italy, you must first understand the mathematics of disbelief. In 1925, the USA's Army War College published a study concluding that black Americans were mentally inferior and cowardly under fire, unsuitable for combat aviation. This wasn't fringe racism. This was official military doctrine, signed and sealed by generals whose names still grace military bases across the South. For 16 years, this pseudo-scientific verdict stood as gospel, an iron ceiling above the aspirations of every black child who ever looked up at an airplane and dreamed. Then came 1941. Not because of enlightenment, but because of necessity. War was devouring pilots faster than America could train them. The Tuskegee program began not as an act of justice, but as an experiment designed to fail to prove, once and for all, that the War College had been right. 992 men graduated from the program. Between 1,941 and 1,946, 450 were deployed to combat theaters. These numbers seem modest until you place them against the backdrop of their mission parameters. The 332nd Fighter Group, flying from bases in Italy, conducted 15,533 combat sorties over a 2-year period. They escorted heavy bombers, flying fortresses and liberators deep into the industrial heart of the Third Reich, Ploesti, Vienna, Munich, Berlin itself. Here is where the numbers become religion. The average fighter group in the European theatre lost approximately 46 bombers per 1,000 escort missions. It was the cost of war, the arithmetic of attrition that generals accepted with cold practicality. Bomber crews knew the odds. 1 in 4 wouldn't complete their 25-mission tour. The sky over Germany was a mathematical execution, but the red tails rewrote the equation. In over 200 bomber escort missions, the 332nd Fighter Group did not lose a single aircraft under their protection to enemy fighters. Not one. Not a single B-17 crew member had to watch a red tail peel away as German fighters swarmed in. The statistical probability of this achievement borders on the impossible, a perfect combat record in the most lethal airspace on Earth. 112 enemy aircraft destroyed. Multiple distinguished flying crosses. A collective combat record that would have made headlines, sparked ticker-tape parades, filled newsreels across America if the pilots had been white. Instead, their story was compartmentalized, minimized, filed away in the margins of history books that preferred more palatable narratives. Because the Tuskegee Airmen didn't just fight the Luftwaffe over Austria and Germany, they fought against the architecture of American racism, a system that demanded their failure and received instead their excellence. And perhaps most cruelly, they fought a war that wouldn't even let them sit at the same lunch counter as the bomber crews they saved. The experiment designed to prove inferiority instead documented genius. But America wasn't ready to publish those results. March 24th, 1945, 29,000 feet above Berlin. First Lieutenant Roscoe Brown saw it before his wingman did a silver dart slicing through the contrails at impossible speed. The Messerschmitt, Me-262 jet fighter, Hitler's technological Hail Mary, could outrun anything the Allies flew. Its twin turbojets screamed at 540 miles per hour, while Brown's Mustang maxed out at 440. In a straight chase, the German jet was untouchable. But Brown wasn't chasing. He was thinking. Years later, he would describe it in his mission log with clinical precision. I saw him making a pass at one of our bombers. I pulled up at him in a 15-degree climb and fired 3 long bursts. I saw strikes all over the fuselage and wings. What the report couldn't capture was the split-second calculus, the angle of deflection, the rate of closure, the moment when physics and instinct converged into a single, sustained trigger pull. The Me-262 hemorrhaged smoke and fragments. Brown watched it tumble out of formation, trailing fire like a dying comet, one of only a handful of jet kills in the entire war, a feat that would earn white pilots, book deals, and speaking tours. Brown's achievement earned him a single line in a classified after-action report. April 11th, 1945. Officers' Quarters, Ramitelli. Second Lieutenant Charles Dryden sat on his bunk, reading a letter from his mother in Alabama. The paper still smelled faintly of her perfume, Evening in Paris, the kind she saved for church Sundays. Her handwriting was immaculate, trained by years of teaching school to black children in a system that gave them discarded textbooks and leaking roofs. Your father tried to vote yesterday, she wrote. They turned him away at the courthouse again, said he couldn't pass the literacy test. Your father, who reads Cicero in Latin and built our house with his own hands, failed a test designed by men who can barely spell their own names. Dryden folded the letter carefully, pressing the creases until they were sharp enough to cut. Outside, he could hear his squadron mates laughing, the sound carrying across the tarmac where their Mustangs sat in neat rows, their red tails glowing in the late afternoon sun. Tomorrow they would escort bombers to Linz. They would dodge flak that could tear a man in half. They would dogfight with pilots trained by the same Luftwaffe aces who had terrorized Europe. And they would do it perfectly. Because anything less would confirm what America already believed about them. That night, Dryden wrote back, "We fight 2 wars here, Mama. One against the Germans, one against the mirror they hold up to America. I'm not sure which enemy sees us more clearly." The letter never made it past the base censor. Too incendiary, the report noted, potentially damaging to morale. April 5th, 1945. Freeman Field, Indiana. While the 332nd dominated the skies over Europe, another battle erupted 4,000 miles away at a training base in rural Indiana. The Freeman Field Mutiny, they would call it, though mutiny suggests disobedience. And what happened that April evening was the opposite. It was obedience to a higher law. 101 black officers walked into the whites-only officers' club. Not with weapons. Not with violence. They walked in wearing their uniforms, their wings, their decorations earned in combat that most of the white officers would never see. They sat down. They ordered drinks. The base commander threatened court-martial. 101 officers refused to leave. Among them was Second Lieutenant Roger Bill Terry, who had flown 26 combat missions over Italy. He had survived German Ack batteries that could turn a P-51 into confetti. He had nursed a crippled Mustang 300 miles back to base on one engine and willpower. He had saved the lives of bomber crews who wouldn't recognize him if they passed him on an American street. Now he sat in an Indiana officers' club, facing down military police, defending the radical proposition that his uniform meant something. "You know what's funny?" Terry said to the MP sergeant, pointing a rifle at him. "Last week I was over Austria, shot down a Fokker Wolf that was trying to kill a B-24 crew from Wisconsin. Saved 12 white boys who'll go home, drink at their officers' clubs, marry their sweethearts, get their ticker tape parades. And tonight, I can't order a beer in my own country. The sergeant had no answer. The rifle didn't waver. Terry and the others were arrested, charged, threatened with dishonorable discharge, a death sentence for military careers built on sweat and excellence, and the quiet dignity of proving everyone wrong. The charges were eventually dropped, but the message had been delivered. Your heroism has limits. Your service has boundaries. Your sacrifice will be acknowledged only when convenient. June 1945. Ramitelli Air Base, final days. Captain Lee Archer finally finished the letter to his mother that he'd started in March. 3 months, 67 more missions, 2 more confirmed kills, 0 recognition beyond his squadron. We came here to prove something, he wrote. I think we did. But I'm not sure anyone was watching who had the power to remember. In the distance, ground crews were already repainting the Mustang tails, removing the distinctive red that had meant salvation to so many bomber crews, that had struck terror into Luftwaffe pilots, that had become a symbol of excellence the military establishment wished would quietly disappear. The war in Europe was over. The Tuskegee Airmen had compiled a combat record unmatched in American aviation history, and America was preparing to forget every single word of it. The cruelest wound isn't delivered in combat, it's delivered in the silence that follows. When the Tuskegee Airmen returned home in the autumn of 1945, they came back as conquerors who weren't allowed to celebrate. New York City threw ticker tape parades for white fighter groups, confetti falling like snow on Fifth Avenue, crowds screaming themselves hoarse, pretty girls kissing soldiers they'd never met. The newsreels played in every theater across America, heroes coming home, democracy triumphant, the righteous victors of a righteous war. The red tails came home to segregated train cars. Captain Roscoe Brown, the man who shot down a jet fighter over Berlin, who flew 68 combat missions without losing a single bomber under his protection, boarded a southbound train in New York wearing his dress uniform, his ribbons, his pilot's wings. At the Maryland border, a conductor forced him to move to the colored car. When Brown protested, citing his rank and service, the conductor replied with 5 words that distilled America's gratitude into its purest form: I don't care where you've been. This was the realization. The moment when the arithmetic of sacrifice revealed its true equation. They had flown 15,533 combat missions, destroyed 112 enemy aircraft, earned 96 distinguished flying crosses, accumulated the finest combat record in American aviation history, and none of it mattered more than the color of their skin. Lieutenant Charles Dryden returned to Alabama to find his father still unable to vote. The same courthouse, the same literacy test, the same men behind the desk who couldn't diagram a sentence if their lives depended on it, determining that a man who had navigated a P-51 Mustang through enemy flak at 400 miles per hour wasn't qualified to mark a ballot. Colonel Benjamin O. Davis, Jr., who commanded the entire 332nd Fighter Group, who had led men in combat with a tactical brilliance that military historians would later compare to Patton and MacArthur, applied for commercial airline positions after the war. Pan Am, TWA, United all rejected him without interview. Not qualified, they said. Not the right fit, as if excellence had a complexion requirement. But perhaps the deepest cut came not from enemies or bigots, but from the institution they had served with such distinction. The United States Air Force, which wouldn't even become independent from the Army until 1947, systematically downplayed the Tuskegee Airmen's achievements in its official histories. Early Air Force museums barely mentioned them. Training manuals ignored their tactical innovations. The perfect bomber escort record was footnoted, qualified, contextualized into insignificance. It wasn't intentional erasure, historians would later claim. It was just oversight. As if you could accidentally forget the only fighter group that never lost a bomber. As if you could overlook 992 men who had to be twice as good to be considered half as worthy. The psychological architecture of this defeat was intricate. Unlike the Jim Crow laws they could see and name, this was a subtler violence, the violence of omission. Their story wasn't actively suppressed, it was simply not told. Not in the history books distributed to schools, not in the war films that Hollywood churned out by the dozen, not in the monuments erected across the nation to honor the generation that saved the world. They had saved bomber crews who would never know their names. They had defended a democracy that refused to defend them. They had proved every racist theory wrong, and received as reward the opportunity to keep proving it, again and again, forever. Some of them broke under the weight of it. Alcoholism, depression, marriages shattered by men who couldn't articulate the rage of being erased while still breathing. But most carried on with the same quiet dignity that had defined their service working jobs beneath their capabilities, raising families, passing on stories that mainstream America refused to archive. And they waited. Waited for a nation's conscience to catch up to its rhetoric. Waited for justice that might never arrive. Waited for the simple, shattering recognition that they had mattered. It would take 62 years. In 2007, President George W. Bush stood in the Capitol Rotunda and presented the Congressional Gold Medal, the highest civilian honor Congress can bestow to the Tuskegee Airmen. Of the original 992 who earned their wings, fewer than 300 were still alive to receive it. They were old men now, their hands steadier than they'd been in 1945, their uniforms replaced by suits that hung looser on frames diminished by time. Roscoe Brown was there, 85 years old. Charles Dryden was there. Lee Archer was there. They stood as America finally said the words it should have spoken in 1945. Thank you. We see you. You mattered, but recognition delayed is recognition denied to the dead. The lesson of the Tuskegee Airmen isn't simply about racism or war or aviation excellence. It's about how nations write their own mythology and who gets written out of it. History isn't an objective record of what happened. It's a curated narrative, shaped by the people with the power to decide what gets remembered and what gets conveniently forgotten. For 6 decades, America chose to forget the Red Tails because their story complicated the simpler narrative of the Good War, the war where America was purely righteous, purely heroic, purely just. But the Tuskegee Airmen's story is the more honest one. It's the story of men who defended a country that didn't defend them, who fought for freedoms they themselves were denied, who proved their worth to a nation that had already decided they had none. And in doing so, they didn't just win a war. They exposed the contradiction at the heart of American democracy, that we demand sacrifice from everyone, but only offer belonging to some. Their red-tailed Mustangs are museum pieces now, polished and roped off behind velvet barriers. But their legacy is still being written in every person who hears their story and understands that heroism isn't always celebrated, that justice often arrives too late, and that the most important battles are sometimes fought not against external enemies, but against our own failures to see clearly, to remember honestly, to honor fairly. The sky over Italy is quiet now. The contrails have long since dissipated. The men who flew through them are almost all gone. But their story remains inconvenient and true, a reminder that America's greatest heroes are often the ones it worked hardest to forget.